Mhm.
Hello, my name is Jesse Rosenberg, and I will be moderating this seminar today. If you have any questions, please place them in the chat box on the bottom right so that they can be answered when it is time. After the workshop, please fill out the survey, which will be sent to your email to let us know what you thought of the presentation. Tonight's presenters are Thomas Pyle and Jerome Kidd. Thomas is an experienced senior executive in banking, business, nonprofit, community health services, and advocacy. He currently serves as president of the NAMI Mercer Board of Directors and runs a family resource website called Psychiatric. Jerome was a successful businessman who suffered financial reversals that led to his becoming homeless for several years. Currently, he is a mental health counselor in West Hampton, New Jersey, who helps individuals, groups, and communities to overcome mental health dysfunctions through customized, holistic solutions. Mr. Kidd earned an undergraduate degree in psychology from Drew University. Let's welcome Thomas and Jerome to the seminar.
Thank you, Jesse.
Well, thank you very much, Jesse Rosenberg, and thank you for all the great work you're doing and volunteering on behalf of NAMI Mercer. Friends, it's a pleasure to be with you. I am Tom Pyle. I'm the president of this august organization, of which we are all members and friends, and which we all hold dear. And my guest today is Jerome Kidd, who has been an intern and a volunteer at NAMI Mercer and has an extraordinary life. And together, we're going to dialogue, Jerome and I, for the next hour or so on the subject of vanquishing the vexation. And what are we talking about? We're talking about housing, especially how hard it is to get and the difficult, complicated courseways that one has to pursue, particularly with a psychiatric disability, in order to get secure and permanent housing. So we're going to dialogue about this. Jerome is a unique individual who has a unique experience in this regard. And I dare say, once we start chatting, you're going to be riveted, as I have been and still am, by Jerome's life story and journey. Because Jerome is going to talk in some detail about where he's been, and he's been all over the housing world, as it were, I thought I would start by just providing a quick, short slideshow that will give an overview, an academic overview, if you like, as to housing from the point of view of this father who has had to think it through and find out where are the pockets of opportunity and how do I make sense, as all of us parents of loved ones are trying to make sense of what is a mind-numbingly complex system sometimes. So before we get to Jerome, I will attempt to share my screen here and take you through this little quick talk, if I may. Okay, how are we doing? Are people seeing my screen? Jerome, are you seeing my screen?
I'm seeing me on your screen.
Oh my goodness. Okay, hold on. I'm going to stop the sharing there. I'm going to share my screen. Let's try that. Nope. Window. Try that. And this. I see. Not working, is it? How about now? 1 second. Does that?
It's working. You just have that on the screen.
Okay, good. Okay, so if people can see this, I'm going to talk a little bit as an academic overview of this question about navigating the housing question, or how do we vanquish the vexation. I'd like to suggest first that we think about housing in three components. There are places for housing by ownership and type. There are payments that help people to afford the housing, and they come in a variety of ways. And then there are supports, particularly for the loved ones that we may wish to get into such housing, be that medications or therapy or supportive employment or education, and so on. So three components. I'd like also to suggest that there are several phases of the housing question, the housing environment. We all might start in our family home, but it only takes one emergency when we wind up in an emergency room, or if we have a family breakup, we're potentially winding up homeless, from which then we can move to so-called transitional housing to get some stability and some gateway to something better. Onward then to supportive housing, then ultimately subsidized public housing or affordable housing, and God willing, get back to regular market rate housing. So these are all the phases of the housing experience. Housing also is differentiated by physical type, I'd like to suggest. You have the family house, you're all familiar with that, There are also group homes. There are shelters, motels, boarding and rooming houses, apartments, regular houses. And as you'll hear from Jerome's experience, people sometimes with severe and persistent mental illness who get homeless have to transit through several of these types of physical types of housing.
Tom, I'm sorry. Are you sharing your screen? Because are you trying to share your screen? Because right now I still see Jerome on the screen.
I am sharing, yes.
The actual presentation is not coming up. It's just Jerome on the screen. It's
Okay.
your screen that's showing up there, but it's not actually what you want to show.
Well, okay. Okay. Well, I'm just going to continue to talk about it then because I can't do any other. I'll just finish with this, if I may. So it's a bit of a cerebral approach. I wish I could get everyone to see the slides, but I cannot. So I'm just going to continue with describing to you housing considered by temporal type, meaning there's transitory or temporary housing on the one hand, and that could include housing in hospitals, jails, shelters, motels, boarding houses, and so on. There's also permanent housing, which is the ultimate goal here. And permanent housing can come in the types of supportive, subsidized, affordable, and ultimately market housing. Housing is also further segmented by the developer. So you can have a public developer, like a public housing authority, as you might suppose occurs in many cities, for instance. And you can also have a private type developer, a developer owner putting up a housing complex and then working with a community housing agency to help place people into that house, into those units that are allocated for affordable or subsidized housing, plus the financial supports that would come with that, partnered by agencies like the U.S. Housing and Urban Development Department, channeling money through the New Jersey Department of Community Affairs, or the New Jersey Housing, Mortgage and Finance Agency for rentals and so on. And then there are housing segmentation by funding source. This is very important, and Jerome will talk about this as well. People talk about housing vouchers, housing choice or Section 8 vouchers. These are vouchers that are funded by the federal government, of which there are two kinds. There's a tenant-based voucher, as Jerome experienced. There's also a project-based voucher, building-based in a building provided by a particular community agency or community. And these are funds, again, from the Housing and Urban Development Department coming through the state's Department of Community Affairs. And then there are state sources, such as vouchers provided by the New Jersey Division of Mental Health and Addiction Services, so-called SRAPs, or State Rental Assistance Program vouchers. These are often 1 year, maybe 2 years in duration, as a transitional funding source for somebody trying to get into affordable housing or supportive housing, and ultimately trying to get into a federally supported voucher program. So you have federal and state funding sources. Okay. All right. So this I have to ask you to think a little bit graphically since you can't quite see it, but I'm looking at a chart, and on the y-axis are services from lowest intensity to highest intensity, and then arrayed along the timeline are the aspects of housing that I was just talking about, the phases of them: the familial, the homeless, the emergency, the transition, the supportive, subsidized, affordable, and market housing. And so I will make these slides available after the talk so you can see this in more detail. If you could see it, it would be populated rather densely with all the various types of housing, depending on where they are along the spectrum, along the phase spectrum of the housing market, arrayed against the intensity of their services. And as Jerome describes his pathway, he will have pursued one of two type pathways through this complex system. The first pathway might occur for somebody who becomes institutionalized, coming out of, let's say, an emergency room, going into a short-term care facility, or more likely to a state hospital, and from a state hospital getting discharged into a group home or into some kind of other supportive housing that might ultimately lead that person, that loved one, into an apartment on the market with some kind of supportive housing and with services and subsidy to enable them to live there. So an institutional pathway. Jerome is going to talk a little bit about the individual pathway. This is not the easier one, I can assure you, where the pathway unfortunately may start in homelessness and then finally get into a sheltered environment through transitional housing and ultimately to where Jerome is today in an apartment with a subsidy. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing the screen and I hope I come back on the screen. Okay, right here. Anybody hearing me?
We hear you, we see you.
Okay,
Yep,
so we
you're
see.
good.
All right, we're good. So I'll invite the audience also to type their questions into the chat box, and we'll leave some time at the end to dialogue a little bit further and try to answer these complex questions. So I turn to Jerome Kidd, my dear friend. Jerome is a local boy here in the Mercer County area, grew up in the Lawrenceville, Trenton area. His dad worked at the Lawrenceville School in custodial services. Jerome became a student at the Lawrenceville School, and indeed he became a pioneer in that school, which is an interesting part of his history. After Lawrenceville, he was at Drew University, where he majored in psychology, and after Drew University, he went out on his own and became an independent and successful businessman in the insurance business. Had an agency, was writing helping to source clients and connect them with policies, all manner of insurance, and thus became very adept in finance and so on, until there was an onset. And Jerome's going to tell you about how that happened with mental illness, and that, unfortunately, down in Virginia, took him out of prosperity and into homelessness. And Jerome then endured not a short time being homeless and trying to figure his way forward here and getting support and help. But things have come right, and we're going to talk a little bit about the epic turning points that led him out of homelessness to where he is now, which is in subsidized housing in Trenton, New Jersey. And he now back at work. His current job is that as a teaching assistant in an elementary school for autism, very interestingly. Prior to that, Jerome was a peer specialist at an outfit called Crosswinds down in Toms River. That was an emergency respite center, which is one of the nodes in the housing question that I was trying to describe before. And then prior to that, he was at our good neighbors Oaks Integrated Care here in the Mercer County area, where he was a partial care specialist. For all that, he was with Legacy Treatment Services, another agency, down at their Kairos Center in Mount Holly, where he was likewise in an emergency respite center. So, Jerome, it's wonderful to have you here. So happy to see you here. I got your background mostly right, I hope. And take us to the time, Jerome, if I may start this off, as what happened from the time you were in a successful insurance agency that you were running until what happened?
Well, thank you, Tom. It's really a pleasure to be able to kind of share the story and have that graph that everyone's going to receive later kind of come to life, because it is a complicated process. And I really wish I had your graphs when I needed them back then. But what happened essentially was I was fortunate enough to be able to sell my insurance agency. I had spent 16 years with the company, but 12 of those years were spent building an agency down in Hampton, Virginia. And I was able to sell that agency to my then partner because I wanted to become an independent agent of my own. So I did that. I actually completed the sale in July of 2000. And by October of 2000, my broker and I had selected certain instruments on the market that we thought would help us out. And they did until 9/11.
You're talking investments.
Absolutely.
You invested,
making,
you earn money from the sale, and then you invest your money in the market.
That's what I did. And, of course, I had left myself there. I don't want to get into all the business aspects, but there's a little sticky thing called a non-compete agreement for those who have ever been in this business that keeps you out of the arena for a little bit. but I was able to try to come back into that arena after about a year. However, things had changed. On 9/11, we just celebrated our 20th remembrance of that, and we'll remember that the stock market essentially crashed within about 30 minutes. And because I had such a new position, I was unable to recover, and it upset my apple cart. And it certainly changed my lifestyle quickly and dramatically.
Are we saying that it wiped you out?
It did wipe me out. I had something to the, to the tune of 2/3 of my sale.
Ah,
You know,
Jerome. And was that a trigger of something that then beset you?
it was, but building a business is very difficult. So when that happened, certainly I was upset, but you have to hit me a little harder than that in order to shake me. So I did at that time start contingency planning and figuring out how am I going to get out of this. And what really exacerbated the situation is for my father to pass away of a massive heart attack. And it just so happened that he did so on Mother's Day, and I had lost my mother 14 years sooner. So it was a combination of things. It was the financial ruin, it was the personal loss, it was the family breakup because we couldn't sustain our relationship, could not sustain that loss. And
Who was the family then? Were you married at the time?
I was married at that time. Yes,
Yeah.
I was married at that time, and we could not remain together under those circumstances. So we had to part ways, and since have become divorced. But those things back to back essentially wore me down, and I started to probably show what was already dormant, and that was the symptoms of bipolar 2.
Indeed. So as all this world was collapsing around you, where were you living at the time?
Well, at that particular time, I was able to, it takes a little while to get you out of your house, but I was living in Newport News, Virginia during that particular time.
And Newport News. So you were in a house.
Yeah,
but something happened.
My house was in Hampton. Based on the breakup of the relationship, I relocated to Newport News, which is only 5 miles away.
So now you're in a rental. It sounds like you got into a rental apartment.
I did.
And then what happened?
Well, things continued to get worse. I mean, we were at that point, I had made several visits to the emergency room with panic attacks. They feel like heart attacks. And I was on a series of medications, some of which I did not adapt well to. So my symptoms actually became worse and not better, because at that time they were treating me for a depressive disorder, not for bipolar, because the mania had not yet presented itself.
Indeed. Now, had you ever manifested bipolar before like this?
Not that I know of. I may have been manic the entire time I put that business together. I don't know. Mania, for those who've experienced it, doesn't always feel bad.
Well, entrepreneurs need a fair amount of it to push it
and
forward.
you can be highly productive sometimes. So, I think it was a combination of my educational background, and if in fact I was manic, I was able to direct it in such a way that benefited me during that period of time.
Right.
However, now it was spiraling out of control.
So now you're in the rental apartment, but you're also in the ER trying to get help. Something's going wrong. You're feeling it. Your medication is also, they're prescribing medications that might be contradicting one against the other, and this is making things worse. And so this sort of foretells further problems. So you started to lose it, I guess. And what happened to your rental situation?
Well, I decided to try to take respite with family for a while. I'd been back to New Jersey prior to this most recent visit back in 2014. I had come up to New Jersey previously to be with my sister and just kind of get my wits about me, if you will, and try to figure out what it is that I was to do. However, I was
the one that plays a role later.
Yeah, absolutely. The very same sister. And I was in absolute denial that there was anything wrong. So I thought, I would blame the medication. I went through the normal process of blaming everything except for embracing the fact that I may have a disorder that I'll have to manage for the rest of my life. I wasn't ready to make that admission at that particular time.
What were you doing for work at the time?
I was doing some business consulting work at that time. Because
Mhm.
of my own business, I had learned a thing or two of more of what not to do rather than what to do.
Mhm.
But I was doing some just gig work during that
Gig
time to
work.
sustain myself.
So hustling a little bit. So finally something happens and you're no longer in the rental apartment?
That's correct.
What happened?
After I'd gone to my sister, I'd entered another relationship. In fact, I'd had a series of jobs. Some of them were memorial counselors at one of the larger cemeteries in Trenton. There was a time at which my focus was so bad that I selected to build bicycles for Walmart. And I did that
Hmm.
for about 4 years, where I was an assembly person for one of the local Walmarts, and
Mhm.
I built the shelving and the bicycles and took care of the small repairs about the store. But it occupied my time. The hours were great. The pay was terrible, but
Mhm.
it did occupy my time, and it allowed me to regain my focus for a short period of time.
Regaining
Which,
your focus was important, and yet you're probably that big shift in your life and personal expectations. That must have been, dare I say, even traumatizing.
well, it is, and it leads to the part that a lot of people don't talk about. It led me to another maybe ill-founded relationship,
Mm.
through which I now have a beautiful 15-year-old daughter. But
Mhm.
at that time, that's probably not what I needed, but it's
Mhm.
exactly what I got. And
Mhm.
we have to understand that some of the things that we do when we're not in the best of mental health have lifelong consequences.
Yeah, they
And in
do.
this case, that consequence is a positive one for
Yes.
me, but it certainly was unexpected.
So in the midst of all this, the stress, I imagine you must have been under some stress, even self-imposed. And so at some point you're having to vacate your rental apartment. Where do you go after that?
Well, the first spot was I ended up sleeping on the reception room couch of my one of my then gigs. I had a
Mhm.
business uh, consulting with a spa, and of course they have very comfortable furniture in the spa. So I was able to make an arrangement to kind of occupy their waiting room when the business wasn't open, and of course vacate during the day.
Hmm.
That didn't last long, and I decided that since the high points of my life were in Virginia, that I would go back to Virginia, and I did
Right.
that in October of 2008.
I see. So you started couch surfing, as it were, in Jersey, and now you're down to Virginia. And
Couch
when you
surfing
landed back,
all over again.
when you landed in Virginia, what was going on? What did you do for work, and where did you stay?
I contacted my previous employer because during the interim, after I sold my business, during that 1 year hiatus, I was certified as a cultural facilitator. And I contacted the gentleman that certified me and see if there was work. And of course, he was able to sustain me for a while financially and give me a place to live. But that kind of runs out after a while. And of course, I was not mentally prepared to take on a client on the company's behalf at that time.
And he provided you a place to live, which is to say his couch
Well, no, he actually put me in a hotel.
in a hotel. Okay, so as I was describing in the complex uh, element of the housing world, yes. So you've been in a rental place, you've been on a couch, now you're in a hotel,
Mhm.
and but that didn't work out.
No, I wish it was a straight progression, but it's not. You bounce back and forth. So you go back to
Hmm.
couch surfing, and
Hmm.
ultimately, the good favor of all your friends runs out, and you
Yes.
find yourself without a place to sleep, and you turn yourself into a shelter. You hear about it on the street, and you find a shelter, and you check yourself in, and that starts a whole nother litany of experiences with regard to where you stay. I can't tell you how many places I've stayed. I've stayed in probably 80% of the churches within Hampton and Newport News at one time or
My
another
goodness.
through the local programs that they had there for the homeless.
Right. Before we probe on the shelter experience and the church basement experience, where was your mind at this time then, and how were you feeling? And were you still in denial as to the psychiatric situation going on?
Yes, I was still in denial, and my mind went completely to security.
Hmm.
Personal security was
Were you
my
getting in?
constant concern.
Were you having any therapy or institutional connection at the time?
I
No.
was not on
Okay.
any medication, and I was not having any therapy. I was completely
Wow.
untreated.
Okay. So what is it like to have to live in a shelter, Jerome?
Scary. Uh,
Scary.
It was a harrowing experience for me. I guess I was a little spoiled. It
Mhm.
certainly wasn't the dormitory life that I was used to
Wasn't
back.
Lawrenceville School, I'm sure about
Wasn't
that.
Lawrenceville School.
Mhm.
So it was, you had to, fortunately, I grew up close enough and spent enough time in urban areas like Trenton where I kind of knew how to live with my head on a swivel. So you kind of
Mhm.
constantly looked out for you became hyper vigilant.
Right.
So things like sleeping with your shoes under your head because you had seen so many people's shoes be stolen while they were asleep at night.
Mhm. Right.
Um, it was a difficult experience on how do you secure your personal belongings? How do you get a good night's sleep? I didn't get a good
Mhm.
night's sleep. I
Right.
mean, if I
Which
was
would
able to get
exacerbate your
a couple
psychiatric
hours
situation.
together, I was lucky.
Mhm. Mhm. So scary, what's the first element of scariness in a shelter? Is it personal safety?
It's personal safety, and it's while I was in denial, I certainly could look around me and tell you that there was something wrong with some of the other people. I
Right.
was more than willing
Right.
to say that, but
Right.
I didn't see it in myself. But
Interesting.
certainly there was some bizarre behavior,
Wow.
some of which resulted in fisticuffs at times,
Right.
and of course they
Right.
didn't tolerate that. They put you out. Some of it resulted in drug use inside the church facility, which of course, when that was discovered, again, you
Right.
were immediately dismissed from the program. But
Right.
there was always something. There was always drama, as I called it. It was
Always
constant
drama.
drama.
I can't believe that was very restful to your mind, and particularly if you were dealing with as yet an undetermined and unconfessed psychiatric issue. Yeah. All right. So take us, if you can, a few steps beyond this. So in the shelter, you were in many institutions. It sounds like you had no particular stability at the time. Um, I don't want to be overly dramatic, but would you care to describe to us what you might conclude was your worst location in the midst of this homelessness?
My worst location, which also led to my worst experience, was when
Hmm.
I was living in a rooming house that was unheated. So it was freezing during the winter and
Hmm.
blistering hot during the summer. We were down
Hmm.
in Virginia. Um, there were just a bunch of guys that were in similar situations for various different reasons. Some of them
Hmm.
had little gig jobs, and some of us didn't. At that time, I was a bathroom valet, and certain
Hmm.
nights per week, I would be at a country western bar handing out paper towels in the bathroom in exchange for tips,
Jerome.
and I used those tips to
Hmm.
pay for my room. However, during this time, from the time that I first went back to Virginia until the time I was living with these gentlemen in this boarding house, I had made 3 suicide attempts.
Oh, Jerome.
And the worst time was when I felt the fourth one coming on, and I called
Hmm.
911 and asked them to please come
Hmm.
get me because bad things were about to happen. And they certainly did. And the
Hmm.
worst moment was probably being put in handcuffs and put in the back of a police car and carried off to the hospital. And then the sheriff's department came and handcuffed you and shackled you and carried you to another hospital.
Jerome.
That was a long night, and it
Jerome. So we, and this sounds like a bit of a turning point. You may still have been in denial, but at least you knew something was not right, I guess, for you to call 911 and to submit to going to a hospital.
I think I had to admit it at that point.
The reality of the moment, I guess you could say. Jerome, easy to laugh about now, I suppose, but that must have been terrorizing.
It is. It's terrorizing when a judge tells you you're going to be there for 2 weeks, whether you like it or not.
And
So
so
I
now
was
you're in
involuntarily committed for 2 weeks.
an involuntary commitment. So as we have it here, and and it was a 2 week stay, was it?
It was, I think, 10
Yeah,
days, 10 to, I believe it may
10
have
to
been 10
2
days, but
weeks.
essentially 2 weeks.
And was there a program there, and were there medications or therapy on offer?
Yeah, they were getting me back. Don't remember which medications, but
Hmm.
they had made prescriptions based on their
Hmm.
assessment. And of course,
Hmm.
there you take your meds because they
Yeah.
check you to make sure that you do.
Hmm.
And I was on a 2 week regimen where things started to get better. And most importantly, I was getting regular meals. I think that was the
Mm.
highlight, if you will, because I had not
Right.
been eating regularly. And one of the things they do tend to are your physical needs. So I was
Right.
sleeping in a comfortable bed. I was getting regular meals, and it made and I was able to socialize with other people who were in similar circumstances.
You know, that's an interesting point that you make, and I'm sure you would agree. A hospital is actually a very stabilizing opportunity for somebody who's in your situation. As they say, three hots and a cot, right? So
Absolutely.
three squares and a place to put your head. So now you're going to get discharged from this. What was the discharge plan?
Back to the rooming house,
Oh,
which
okay.
was very
That was,
difficult. I mean, you're back
oh,
in the same environment where you've had your worst moment, and
uh-huh.
you're back there all over again. And I resumed the bathroom valet job, and we carried
Mhm,
on for a while as if nothing had happened.
mhm,
But at one point, my sister asked the local police. I had not been in touch with my immediate family for 2 years at this point.
mhm,
And they were wondering, is he okay? Let's find out if he's okay. So they became very concerned about my well-being, and they asked the local police to do a wellness check at the
mhm.
last known address, which I was still occupying. And my sister, we finally made contact with each other, and she says, "Well, Jerome, how are you doing?" And I said, "Well, sis, to be quite honest, I'm waiting to die."
Ah,
And at this point, I'm all of 5'9". I weighed 105 pounds. And
ah,
there were times where, a bag of sugar is pretty cheap. So to keep myself energized, I literally would eat sugar for certain meals.
ah, Jerome,
Teeth were
your
terrible.
story, your
You know,
your
it was,
story constantly amazes me. All right,
it,
so where have you been? You've been uh, the descent of bipolar has taken you down, sadly, and this
yes,
caused you to lose your family, lose your uh, uh, well, the loss of your wealth prompted some of this, but the family collapsed very sadly. You were in a rental apartment, then it deteriorated from there. You've been in shelters, you've been in church basements, you've been in boarding houses, and now it's sounding pretty desperate, such that you're contemplating a demise. And your sister, by God's
rescued
grace,
me.
calls you,
Yeah, absolutely
right?
rescued me. I'll never forget those days. That was February 4th of 2014. She says, "I'll call you back." She did so on the next day. And then on February 7th of 2014, she had arranged that I would arrive in Philadelphia on the megabus. And they met me there, and my life began to change.
So I'll just stop and say one thing very important here. Family members must never give up on their loved ones if they're in dire straits and if they get disconnected. And so here's your sister demonstrating, exemplifying uh, a family member concerned for the loved one against all odds. So she had to call the police, and the police found out where you were. Isn't that interesting?
And
Uh,
it was really the shame. The reason I had not been in touch
uh,
with my family is because I was ashamed to be in touch with my family, and I was afraid of what they might think. So I was
yes,
self stigmatizing the
right.
situation. And
No contact with Lawrenceville, no contact with Drew
no,
or any of
no,
your alumni
absolutely not.
friends and so on. Right.
Absolutely
So,
not. I
so
didn't
the
want
whole
anyone
world
to
that you
know.
knew was gone for the time being.
That's correct.
So the guardian angel of a sister calls you and they get you up to Philadelphia. You step off that bus. Now
And
what's
that's when you
happening?
feel how much they love you.
Yeah.
That was a pivotal moment for me because I knew somebody cared. The result of me opening up and just telling them what was really happening,
Yes.
got an instant response of support.
Wow.
Not
So
everyone has that
no, they
I've
don't.
been around a lot of people that that suffer similarly or maybe
Right.
even worse than I do, and a lot of people just don't have that.
You know, just as a sidebar, when I teach family to family and I work with other family members, oftentimes we family members are ourselves at our wits' end. Now, you were clearly at the end of your rope, but it's a whole family system and a family dynamic, and it's not always going down well with family members either. So, fortunately, your sister did not abandon you, and almost just by some inspiration, thought to check in on you. Okay, so we're now in. So where are you living now? I guess
So
your sister takes you in for for a while.
my very first stop after pizza and a root beer, because I was hungry.
A&W, I hope.
Yes, it was right there. I believe it was A&W Root Beer. It was one of
Right.
our local establishments in Trenton. Since
Yeah.
they didn't pay us, I won't say their name, but you know,
Yeah.
she took me off to the crisis center in Trenton to put all jokes aside and
At the
had
Blaine-Fould Hospital, right? Mhm.
yes. And at that time, they did not see where I needed to be an inpatient. So she took me into her home,
Into
which
the home.
happens to have been the family home that we all grew up in Hamilton. She had now occupied it after my father's
Mhm.
death. And
Mhm.
that's where I was. I was back in my old room.
Interesting. So you're back in a house. You're back in the first house that you were ever in, as it were, and with family around. Were you getting treatment at the time, Jerome?
I was. She insisted on it. I
She
was
insisted.
getting medically reviewed and making sure that everything
Uh-huh.
medical, because as many people may know, sometimes the symptoms of a medical illness may mimic mental illness.
Sure.
So they kind of clear you on the medical side, and then they know to isolate and begin to focus on either substance use
Right.
or on mental illness from a
Yeah.
physiological
All
standpoint.
right.
So
So
anyway, she
let
did
me just
insist
quickly
that
stop
she
here.
helped me. She took me to all of my appointments. She made sure I got there.
So you're in her guest bedroom. You are getting some treatment. Thank God for that. Now, before we go any further, I'll just turn to the audience now and say, if you have any questions, please put them into the chat or get them over to Jesse Rosenberg. We'd be happy to address them. We're now at the point of Jerome's story, as I understand it, where things might start to be turning around a little bit, but the housing situation is not yet solved. So you're at your sister's place. Uh, she's making you do some stuff, okay, for your own good, but maybe that's not working out for you somehow.
Well, I had a chore list, but I would wait till about 15 minutes before I knew she was going to arrive from work, and I would kind of, make it look like I had done my chores. And certainly, she
Right.
was able to see through it and told me that later on she knew what I was doing. But
Hmm.
it was the depression portion at that time
Yes.
of bipolar 2 that made it very difficult to do anything.
Right.
So I even wondered myself if I was just lazy, and it's
Yeah.
beyond laziness. I can't
Yes.
describe the malaise that you feel when you're under a heavy and deep depression. So
Yes.
as you mentioned earlier, at some point the family can't take that anymore. So even
Ah.
though my sisters, I had two sisters involved, one during the week, which is the one that made all the arrangements, and then
Right.
another on the weekends. So on
Right.
Friday evenings, when she would pick me up after work and I'd go down to her place, and she would insist that I attend worship services with her. And on
Right.
Monday morning, she'd take me back to the program and we do it all over again. Well,
Yeah.
after about 8 to 10 months of doing that, they arrived at one of my family team meetings with my
Hmm.
counselor, and they were in tears. They said, "We just can't do it anymore.
Wow. So
That
they were.
spirit of heaviness is starting to invade our lives, and
Yeah.
we have to now save ourselves as well. And he's
Right.
got to go somewhere else."
And was your sister? Did your sister have children? Were they in the picture as well?
Yes, she
Yeah.
did have a son that was also there, and he was observing all this, and he was at a very
So
impressionable age.
so very stressful on the whole family. The family dynamic was creaking, as it were. All
Yes, they
right.
had
Well,
three kids at home,
so
both of
now
them.
what? So now,
Well,
ever so regretfully, you have to move it on.
we were discussing someone before we came on that should qualify for sainthood. Well, I think that my
Yeah.
crisis intervention counselor, who I understand may still be in senior management at Oaks, she
Right.
qualifies for sainthood.
Amen.
During my intake, which was done in my house because I
Right.
wasn't able to really get out and do it. They stopped by the house, did the intake. I didn't know at that time that she had also applied for housing for me. And
She did.
because I had an application in with HUD for Section 8, it opened up some doors for some other temporary housing. And therefore, I ended up in a supportive housing situation with one of our local organizations called Serve.
So let me
And
stop you right there. This
Mhm.
is a very important moment. Unbeknownst to you, a counselor at Oaks thought that this man's going to need some housing first, as it were. He's got to get a
You
stable
apply
place
for
to live,
SSI, SSD, and
right?
Section 8.
So the housing piece, however, is reliant on the funding supports that you just mentioned. SSI, supplemental support income, which is an indigence payment, and that was blended with, I suppose, your Social Security disability payment, to which you were presumably entitled because you had been working and thus banking into the system, right?
That's correct.
Were you at a point though where that the amount available to you from Social Security disability or whatever it was not enough, and thus you had the SSI to bolster that up to a minimum level?
It's actually worse than that.
Worse.
They qualified me for the SSI,
Uh-huh.
but they disqualified me for the SSD based on the last date insured being prior to what they considered to be my official onset of illness, which was my
Right.
diagnosis in 2014. So they basically discounted anything that happened in Virginia. You
So
know,
this
that you
was,
actually
it's almost a
became disabled.
technicality. They got you on a technicality, it sounds.
Yes, they got me on the technicality
Wow.
that took 7 years to clear up.
7 years. Ends well in the end, but that's a very important consideration because the combination of you need an income flow of some kind. In your case, SSD or only SSI, but in any event, that flow begins to lubricate the wheels for getting into some kind of supportive or subsidized housing. Why is that? Because you are required, were you not, even in some very small amount of money that you might be receiving, to pay some 30 or 40% of that amount towards the rent of wherever you were staying so that you could qualify for the housing voucher that would subsidize the rest. Did I get that right?
That is correct. The percentage I remember being a little bit higher than that because there were some services that came along with the supportive housing.
Right.
But the concept is absolutely correct.
So this is an important point for the housing equation, and families should be thinking about this. And that is to say that the loved one, as that angelic Oaks social worker determined, have got to also get it into those supports where those flows can occur. That does require sometimes that they then be willing, and maybe you were willing at the time, to be declared disabled. Was that part of the equation here?
That's correct. I think
So,
by
but
her
this,
own observation, I wasn't even at that time. I was so despondent. I didn't answer most of the questions myself. My sister was knowledgeable
yeah,
enough of my
right.
circumstances to be able to answer that. And I only had this person on my caseload for 60 days. Crisis
Amazing.
intervention doesn't last forever, but she
Yeah.
did a life-changing work within those 60 days that I wasn't even aware had begun.
Afterwards, you'll have to give me her name. We'll have to give her NAMI Service Worker of the Decade Award. So,
I would
all
support
right.
that.
So this is in the mix, and the SSI or supplemental support income somehow gets granted. You're getting a de minimis amount of money, and then tell us a little bit about the process after the application is submitted. You probably have to go around and look for some apartments. You have if you're getting a housing voucher, you have some cap on the amount that you can rent. So you're probably down around the $900 mark, or maybe it was lower then. And there are not many options at that very low top threshold amount that you can use. Is that
Some
right?
of the places that I investigated were just as bad as the place that I was living in Virginia. Um, it was it
Uh,
it was unfit, and I don't know. I
yeah,
probably looked at some 30 or 40 locations,
yeah,
and it wears you out. You only
yeah.
have 90 days to
Yes,
exercise that voucher, or it could potentially go away unless you apply for an extension. And I had to apply for at
yes.
least one extension because I was at the
Mm,
90-day mark when I finally was able to meet all the qualifications of a security deposit and
right,
all the income requirements and all the other
right,
things that many properties have in order for them to take your voucher.
right.
I ended up in actually a pretty nice place, if you ask me, transportation hub that had recently been redeveloped from a historical bank building into
Yes.
luxury apartments.
So this is
So
the place where you are now, as it happens, is it?
that I had been there for 5 years and have enjoyed it immensely.
Amazing. And tell us about the apartment. How big is it?
It's about, I would say 750 square feet, and I'm just guessing, but I've done a lot of insurance, so I kind of know square
Mhm.
footage, but it's about 750 square feet, hardwood
Right.
floors, 12-foot ceilings, windows that are, it's got the biggest door I've ever seen. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a lot of
Yeah.
the old artifacts are still in the building, including the original safe is still in the
Yes.
art
Yes.
gallery. But yeah,
Downtown
they did a
Trenton.
wonderful
Yeah.
job with this rehab. I mean, I have marble sills on my doors, and
Wow.
it's a great apartment that I would not have been able to afford without assistance.
Well, the main thing is that you have a permanent place and you
That's
have a
correct.
secure place, and
Yes,
you're the tenant on the lease, I suppose. Is that
I
right?
am.
You are. And so, uh, can you describe the dynamics? How does the money flow? Who's paying for the rental subsidy for you?
The rental subsidy I never see. It goes
Mhm.
directly from the funding source to the
Mhm.
landlord, to
Right.
their property management company.
Right.
I pay the balance. So you get a award letter once a year when you
Right.
recertify, telling you
Right.
what your balance is, and it remains that way unless there is some change in your income, which you must report within 10 days.
Right.
They're pretty serious about that.
Yeah.
And
Uh-huh.
and you just go down and make your normal payment, and that's it. It almost feels like you're, and I'll disclose this.
Mhm.
Because I was only on SSI,
Mhm.
my payment for my rent when I first moved in this apartment was $2 per month.
Wow.
So I went and got a money order. I had $25. I got the money order for 24, and I paid $1 for the money order, and I paid it up for the whole year. But that's how much those programs can help you. The
Wow.
calculation was such
And it's
that
such a
I paid negligible, almost no rent.
yeah, that's important to stress because I dare say you were probably still at a very frail moment. Uh, you were in transition. I want to ask you a little bit about what you were doing during this time, but thank God for that social worker who put in that
Absolutely.
application. Thank God for the system that funded it. Probably didn't come so fast or so easy because bureaucracies are what they are, and sometimes cages have to be rattled. But good to know that there was a system there, a safety net. Let's just say what it is. Now, before I ask you where are you today, just tell us about what you were doing now that you found a place to stay. What were you able to do in the 5 years or so since you've been in that apartment? And I'm talking about some of your work at AAMH and elsewhere.
Well, the first step was intensive therapy.
Hmm.
Back then, Oaks had later acquired what was called Greater Trenton. So I was with Greater Trenton Behavioral Health for what was called
Hmm.
the IOP program, Intensive Outpatient Program.
Intensive outpatient, right?
Was a half-day program that provided transportation to and from, and that went on for me for just about a year. And then I went from that to partial care, and that was
Hmm.
up at All Access Mental Health in Princeton.
Hmm. Right.
And I was there for the balance of what ended up being 50 months. So I was there for 40 months. And for the first 2 years, I probably did not say 10 words. And
Wow.
for those who know me when they first met me at NAMI, they knew I've already spoken more than I did in some years just in this program. So
Right.
it was very difficult. I was again ashamed. I felt ashamed, and I didn't
Right.
want people to know. Even though I was in a treatment facility, I just didn't
Yeah.
want them to know my business.
Yeah.
And
Yes. Yes.
it was until I opened up, very little progress was made. I was just going and coming every day and enjoying their
Right.
lunch, and but very little progress was being made. But I was learning principles. I was learning CBT. I was
Yes.
learning the DBT concepts. I was learning different things. Even though I wasn't ready to apply it, I was beginning to understand how they work. After
Yeah.
all, I was a psychology major, so I
Yeah.
understood the mechanisms, but I
Right.
did not engage with them for probably the first 18 to 24 months.
So before we open up to questions, 2 years, uh, sort of taking it all in. But from my point of view, what is permanent and consistent that actually allows you to be in that session every day, even if you're not talking? It's the housing. You're
Yes.
secure, you're safe, you're certain, and thus you can work on the recovery.
And the
And then
housing
something
considered
happened
use a gainful activity.
and gainful
Otherwise I
activity.
would have been down at what is it? One Stop, I believe they call it, where you're searching for jobs on a regular basis.
Yes,
I had the
yes.
good old Med One form. For those who have come this way, you understand the importance of having a Med One form that says that this person
Mhm.
cannot work currently for some period of time, and
Right.
therefore must have some other gainful activity during the day, which for me was therapy.
So finally, the light bulb went on, something clicked, and you started to participate in the therapy, and you started to drive the therapy in your own recovery. You started to accelerate that, I suppose.
The woman who described me, we would go around and describe how we were feeling every morning. And there was a woman who has since passed on, but she described to me that day. Her
Mhm.
description of how she felt was my description of how I was feeling.
Yeah.
And I didn't think anybody else in the world could have felt that way, but she did. So when she described it, the light, I mean, it came on like instantly. It's like, oh my
Yeah.
God, that's
Mhm.
me. You know, so by going, even though I wasn't participating, just by going, I probably would have missed that opportunity had I not been attending the sessions. So even though it took as long as it did, and maybe I could have gotten here a little quicker, it took that moment of me being able to completely identify with her description of how she was feeling to finally embrace my recovery.
Well, now, Jerome, this story then goes from leaps and bounds forward, and you have since graduated from AAMH. You are now, you've studied up to be a peer specialist provider. You are also getting certified in other areas. And as I described the litany of your achievements since all this, emergency respite center down at Legacy Services, partial care counselor at Oaks Integrated Care, over at Crossroads and Toms River, again, an emergency respite situation. Now you are interning to be as a teacher's aide in a school for autistic children. This is amazing progress, it seems to me, of self-actualization, self-realization. So let me just ask you first to comment on where you are and what's ahead for you personally.
Wow, I'm at a crossroads at this very moment. I'm under consideration for potential employment in some other mental health organizations here in the state. I'm also actually, I've already applied and waiting for some responses from New York on some justice organizations there, some restorative justice. I almost lost the word. Restorative justice programs out in New York. So my future is great, and part of it was the vocational groups at AAMH. So I guess what I'm encouraging anyone to do is, even though I was bored to tears half the time, or at least I thought I was actually beginning to absorb some of the things that they were talking about in some of the vocational groups. And my biggest challenge was, how in the world am I going to fill this gigantic gap in my resume? So that's when I realized that you could become a certified peer and take all of this that I've experienced and help somebody else come out of the fire.
Totally.
You know, so there is a demand for that, simply because when you start talking to me about depression or mania, I don't have to guess what that is.
Yeah, or homelessness.
I almost know what that feels like.
Yes.
Because been there, done that, and I have the scars. You know, so it's a little bit different, not better, but different than your ordinary practitioner.
You have the scars on your back, brother, but you also have the stars on your chest of achievement that brought you to this wonderful point. And I even know a little bit about your personal life, and it's going to get even better if things work out as I think you have told me. So we'll stay tuned for that personal portion later. But how would you, if we can sum this up, in talking about housing, Jerome, it strikes me how important housing is for recovery. Steady, solid, permanent housing, how hard it is to get, how many stations along the way you had to transit through to get to it. What is your conclusion then about how do we vanquish this vexation called housing? What are your concluding thoughts about housing?
There were some key components that made for me, first of all, let me say that I think the system worked for me. You know, there weren't that many troublesome moments. The system itself is very complex, and when they get your slides, they'll see that. So navigating it without someone on the inside that understands, and I mean some type of support counselor, is difficult. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's difficult no matter how well educated you are, because some of it just doesn't make sense. You know, so that's the first thing, is do engage the helps that are there. And once you become serious about engaging your recovery, I mean, you have to embrace your recovery or it's not going to happen. You know, I learned that the hard way, but then the housing picture starts to brighten up, because I think somewhere people begin to realize that you really do want to get better. You know, toward the end here, what I'm starting to realize is it becomes a little bit of a poverty trap, and maybe there'll be another opportunity to talk about that, because as your income starts to grow, your rent dramatically starts to grow too, back to the market level. And if we know about how rents have been progressing, the market level was pretty substantial.
Yeah.
So being able to calculate that, and that's why some of my jobs have vacillated. Unfortunately, sometimes I just made too much money and I couldn't afford the new rent that came along with that because I wasn't used to paying that proportion of my income.
Right.
Because I didn't have, who can't handle $2 in rent, but of course it started to increase to the point where you were paying 50 to 70% of the rent now because that's your income.
Right.
So that was difficult to manage. But at this next step, which I anticipate doing here well before the end of the year, I'll probably be completely back on market rate housing because I will have
Amazing.
earned myself out of Section 8. And I think that's what it's designed to do ultimately.
Yes,
I mean,
I think so.
Yeah.
Although it's a very hard road and there are many inconsistencies and conundrums along the way.
Yes.
Well, Jerome, I see there were 3 key people in this incredible story of yours. There are obviously more. I mean, we can go back further, but let's talk about your sister, the
Absolutely.
angel
Love
who
them.
descended upon you,
All my sisters are
rescued.
angels.
So your sister, and let's talk about the social worker at Oaks who put in that application for the housing. And finally, let's talk about Jerome Kidd, who made the final decision to really get real with his situation and end the denial and get traction going and invest in himself. Do the work. I guess we could say do the work. And look where what it's resulting in now.
You have to
As you
be
said,
willing to meet yourself where you are. I didn't
where
know
you
that.
are.
What has really happened here is I now know what I'm made out of for the most part.
Oh man,
I know a lot
it's
of my
incredible.
strengths. I recognize a lot of my opportunity areas. But most importantly is I got real with me. And I stopped living that ideal self and I started living the real self. And I start working on that real self to move it in the direction of the ideal self, or the ideal self eventually becomes irrelevant.
Yep.
Because the real
And
self is so much more fun.
so that's a great message for loved ones. What's your parting message also for the family members of loved ones?
Don't give up on us. We do some really interesting things sometimes that may cause our family some anguish, but please don't give up on us because
And it takes time, doesn't it? It takes time.
Some more than others. And,
Yeah.
I have a little guilty streak because why didn't I do this sooner? Because I couldn't.
You weren't ready. Yep. Jerome Kidd, you constantly amaze me. Let me turn to the audience and ask Jesse if we have any questions. Would anybody like to ask Jerome Kidd or possibly myself a question that we might try?
Thank you, Janet.
No questions up here as of yet, but I just want to say your story is very inspirational, and it's amazing to hear it, and I appreciate both of you guys coming on.
I appreciate the opportunity to represent NAMI in this way.
Well, we are delighted that you're part of the NAMI family, Jerome. You are a blazing light for us. While we're waiting for any questions, Jesse, are we recording this tape, and will we have this available for anyone who would like to see it later?
Yes, of course. It will be on the NAMI Mercer website on the YouTube.
All right. One of the things I think we could also say, if I may, Jerome, is that we also got to know you in the NAMI family because of your work with us. You helped us as an intern and as a volunteer. I know personally, for instance, you were very helpful in the Hearing Voices group that we got started. You you were cultivating some of your own facilitation skills, but you brought, I think, to that group an enormous sense of understanding and empathy wrought from your own personal experience, which is so important in the whole equation. The more that peer providers, peer counselors can be a part of this, the more they can bring their lived experience to bear for the benefit of the loved ones and the family members, especially family members, because family members often need to hear your story and those like it, Jerome, from the perspective of the loved one, as sometimes cannot be conveyed when the families are in such incredible stress, given the intensely personal and difficult circumstances they find themselves in. So, well, good.
For all the thank yous that are coming into the chat, it's my pleasure. Hopefully someone has heard something that reminds them of themselves, and it'll help them make that next step.
Well, Jesse, I'm not seeing any questions, but no questions are out there. So we'll leave it here for the time being, unless somebody pops in a quick urgent one. We want to be respectful of people's time, and we're just at 8:04, so we're just at about the hour. Um, I will make my slides available through Janet Haig and Nami Mercer for those who would like to see them. I am also personally available to anyone who would like to talk from my perspective, that is the family perspective, how to interpret this complexity. And I'm sure Jerome would be more than willing to respond. We want to be mindful of his time and his other obligations, but his story is so compelling and so moving and inspiring, may I say. So I hope we can get another shot at you, Jerome. We have more to
Always.
talk and more to dialogue, brother. And your journey is so exciting and so inspirational, so uplifting.
I appreciate
So,
all that NAMI has been able to do, because they took me in where I was very, I was still unstable, and did not have my confidence. So thank you for giving me my confidence back. Thank you for allowing me to hone my skills again. And hopefully I can continue to move forward supporting NAMI in bigger and better ways.
well, it's our pleasure to have you in the fold, and we look forward to more and better yet to come. Well, Jerome Kidd, a pleasure to be with you, my dear friend. And thanks to the NAMI team, Jesse Rosenberg. Thanks to Janet, Danita, Julia, and the team at NAMI Mercer for getting this together. Thanks to Maddie Monheit, the incredible Maddie Monheit, for getting organized this Harvest of Hope and in this interesting format. It's just a wonderful program every year, and it keeps getting better and better. I don't know how they do it at the NAMI staff. So with that, I'll be saying goodbye to my good friend Jerome and to everybody who's online. And thank you all. And keep us all at NAMI Mercer in your thoughts, hearts, and prayers. And let's keep it going all together for the rest of this year.
You're not alone.
You're not alone, indeed. Best regards to one and all. We'll sign off now.
Thank you,
Bye.
guys. Have a good night.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you.